Hi everyone, in this lecture I'll be going over common developmental and mental health disorders in childhood. We'll start with autism spectrum disorder. So 1 out of every 59 children in the US has been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and it is a developmental disorder that affects communication and behavior. This disorder is often associated with difficulty learning language, as well as difficulty reading social cues, such as the meaning of nonverbal gestures. And it also is associated with difficulty empathizing. There may also be some sensitivity to touch or visual stimulation among children who have autism spectrum disorder. There's a lot of overlap between autism and what is supposed to be happening cognitively at this time at this time of development. First off, recall that children are already still pretty egocentric at this age and struggle with deductive logic. With autism, this intensifies, and they may struggle with relating with peers based on what other people enjoy, since they're fixated on what they enjoy. They may also struggle with learning things that are not concrete or that they haven't personally experienced. They're still kind of stuck in the sensory stage. They remain very literal in their perception of the world, which will become more problematic as we advance into the formal operations stage. In the cognitive developmental stage, it's still relatively normal. But as we continue to advance developmentally, it'll become more of a problem. Changes in expectations and routines associated with going to school, for example, can be distressing. The same is true of being part of a large group where there's a lot of sensory stimulation. So larger classroom sizes tend to be more difficult. Children with autism will thrive in structured environments with fulfilling events, predictability, and smaller class sizes in particular. All right, ADHD is another common disorder of childhood. It involves difficulty staying on task, difficulty screening out distractions, and difficulty with inhibiting behavioral outbursts or impulsivity. These children are trying to pay attention, but the issue is that they're trying to pay attention to too many things at once, and so everything suffers. So it isn't that they can't focus, it's that they're focusing on lots of different things at once. Some studies suggest that the frontal lobe is underdeveloped in children and adults with ADHD. And remember that the frontal lobe is involved in executive function, attention, planning, and impulse control, as well as motivation and decision making. And so it would make sense that there would be a link between ADHD and brain development of the frontal lobe in particular. Now, a diagnosis of ADHD is especially difficult in middle childhood because a certain degree of this impulsivity and this difficulty focusing is developmentally normal at this age. So in many cases, what we're wanting to see with a diagnosis of ADHD is that the impulsivity and the distractibility and so on is evident in multiple different arenas. So it's not just happening at school, it also happens at home or in social interactions or in other situations. And so this is definitely one that you need to assess very carefully for. Learning disabilities are also another issue that we'll see here. So with learning disabilities, the child is having problems in a specific area or with a specific task or type of activity related to education. Signs and symptoms between the ages of 5 to 7 are listed here and include things like trouble learning the connection between letters and sounds, being unable to blend sounds to make words, for example, bed, right? These children may also confuse basic words when reading for something like dyslexia, for example. They may be a little bit slower to learn new skills. They might have trouble with spelling or with learning basic math concepts or difficulty telling time and remembering sequences and patterns. And again, some of this is just a product of being a bit slower at learning or being exposed to this type of content for the first time. So there are special testing procedures that are done in order to identify whether this is in fact a learning disability or more of a developmentally appropriate issue. Some potential complications arise over early diagnosis that I think are important to share. Traditionally, we know that early diagnosis is seen as super helpful and caregivers are told not to wait if they think that something may be amiss. They are instructed or encouraged strongly to get the child tested. And the reason is that early diagnosis does improve chances of success and intervention. Okay. And if it does turn out that the child has some kind of a learning disability or autism or something like that, they can receive the interventions that they need early on and be a little bit less likely to fall behind in the future. Nonetheless, there are some issues, right? There are social implications with early diagnosis. Once a child is labeled with a particular diagnosis, it influences the way that teachers and peers interact with them, consciously and unconsciously. Another issue is the self-fulfilling prophecy. If the child is aware that they've been diagnosed with something, is that going to make them feel like they're going to fail anyway, so why try, right? And of course, that's going to depend on how much understanding the child has over what they've been diagnosed with, but it's important to keep in mind. And then finally, teacher expectations. A teacher who is working with a child who has a particular mental health issue or a disorder may have lower expectations of them, again, consciously or unconsciously, or they may just feel like they don't know how to work with this particular child, and they might not be able to get the resources that they need in order to help that child. So how can we help? I think a big piece of what we can do as therapists is to advocate for children during their IEP or 504 planning meetings. It's really important during those times and outside of those times to communicate with all members of the student's team, including the family, the teacher, the administrator. If they have a one-on-one, the one-on-one, like there's a lot of case coordination that needs to happen. Sending updates home, keeping everybody aware of what treatment goals are and interventions that you're using so that there can be consistency across all of the different settings that the child is in. Prior to meetings, prior to IEP meetings or 504 plan meetings, it's important to meet with the parent or the caregivers and perhaps even with the teacher regarding planning and goal setting so that you can help the parent or caregiver to advocate for the child and so that you have insight into what's going on. It can also be really helpful if the school allows it for you to go into the classroom and observe the child's behavior firsthand, as well as observe their behavior out in the playground. Now with things being virtual, seeing if you can join the Zoom meeting and observe that somehow would be great. I know there are some issues with privacy and confidentiality, so you'll need to figure out how exactly to go about doing that. But if you can observe and have firsthand knowledge and information to share in those meetings, that's going to be really great. You also want to make sure to document everything, collect samples of the child's work if you can, or do of the child's art, like in therapy with you, perhaps. And this will allow you to have a visual representation of pre and post therapy. Remember to always be professional and courteous at the meetings. Yes, you're there to communicate and advocate, but you're also there to listen and to respect everyone's opinions. You want to make sure to be flexible and be open to suggestions. Your way is not the only way, and everyone is there for the common goal of supporting the child. So work together as a team. You also want to use everyday terminology and not a bunch of psychological jargon that might go over people's heads or just might not be helpful. Okay. And stay positive. Remember to focus on strengths and on moving forward. These meetings can become very deficit focused. And so you can be the voice of positivity there by highlighting the child's strengths and being creative about figuring out how to use those strengths to support the child and make up for the deficits. Okay. In terms of how to promote cognitive and academic growth and how to encourage development, more time in educational settings is helpful. The more they can be immersed in classrooms and practicing the skills that they're learning, the better. More stimulating and engaging environments for some children may be helpful. So more things for them to touch, more things for them to experience. Small class sizes are helpful, especially on like Zoom classes, for example, having a small class where the child is paid attention to, or having one-on-one lesson time for the child will help them to stay engaged and not get bored. Prioritizing education in the family, so modeling that learning is important and is valuable, doing homework together, reading together, all of those things will be helpful. And having high expectations, of course, reasonable expectations, but high expectations. If the child feels like you as the parent or as the therapist feel like they're never going to amount to anything, that's going to rub off on them, and it's going to influence what they expect of themselves. So having high expectations within reason is helpful. Now, shifting slightly to a different topic, but related topic with learning and cognitive development and such, is technology. And technology is now even more important with so many things being online. So first, I'm going to come back to that slide. First, I want to discuss the American Association of Pediatrics recommendations. So according to their recommendations, children under the age of 2 shouldn't watch TV or have any screen time. And then preschooler screen time should not exceed 1 to 2 hours per day. And then children older than the age of 6 are okay to have some screen time, but that should be monitored closely and should be definitely not be the bulk of their day. Nonetheless, the fact of the matter is that children and adolescents are in an increasingly technology-driven world, and it's gotten more and more difficult to restrict screen time. Then when you add in COVID, screen time is the only way for many kids for schooling, social interaction, and entertainment for them to get any of that. And so how much can you really restrict that? So rather than leave it at these guidelines alone, I think it's helpful to explore the issue in a more in-depth way and consider how screen time can be beneficial, as well as how to become more mindful and aware of the screen time that our children have access to. So I'm going to come back to this one here. So research has indicated that the amount of educational TV watching before age 3 was not a predictor of attention problems later, which does go against some of what is commonly thought, that any type of screen time before the age of 3 is bad. So there's something about the content of that screen time that matters. So more interestingly with this, watching educational TV was actually linked to improved school readiness, vocabulary growth, and better number skills in kindergarten. So there are some benefits to educational screen time for young children. However, entertainment TV does have some links to reduce performance in school, and violent TV in particular is associated with some more severe problems with learning and development. So I have on the left here Storybots, which I'm a big fan of. It's an educational TV show that teaches lessons in song form and is, I think, a great version of an educational TV show that kids can watch. And I know my kids in particular have learned a whole bunch from it. Okay, we talked about that. Next is computers. So there's obviously a lot of benefits to giving children experience with computers. And now with most schools being held online, it has become unavoidable. Nonetheless, it's important to balance this screen time with other activities that are beneficial for development, such as outdoor play. But we can't forget that restricting computer access too much and not prioritizing literacy in computers is actually going to be a disadvantage nowadays. Children are going to be expected to be able to navigate computers or tablets or what have you as part of everyday learning in a lot of cases. So we want to encourage it, but at the same time, balance it with other forms of learning and other types of activities. All right, and then we have video games. So although video games do get a very bad reputation, there are actually quite a few cognitive benefits associated with their use. For example, playing video games may help children improve their ability to pay attention to small details, improve their visuospatial skills, and facilitate problem solving. It's important to remember, though, as with anything, that certain games are going to be more appropriate and helpful, while others may be more detrimental. For example, games with sexual content or a lot of violence are not going to be very helpful, and they can actually skew values and moral development during a really pivotal period of learning. Okay. It's also important to remember, though, that this isn't a direct association, right? There is no, as far as I'm aware, direct association between if you watch a violent video game or participate in a violent video game, you are going to be violent. It doesn't work that way, although that is, I know, the message that is often portrayed. I also want to hone in a little bit here on Fortnite, because this is one game that continues to be particularly popular. I personally don't know why, but it is. And given its popularity, I've included some pros and cons for this particular game that may be helpful. And you might be able to use this information as you engage in psychoeducation with parents. So with this game in particular, there are some pros. On the one hand, it does create this third space where children can socialize and play, which now with COVID is especially important. It does allow forming of social connections for kids who might otherwise lack them because of self-esteem issues or because of cliques that form in schools. It teaches skills like collaboration and problem solving during the gameplay. And it is available on multiple systems, so it's not necessarily an added expense for parents. The violence that is depicted in Fortnite does not include the depiction of blood, which may be reassuring for some parents. And it is designed to allow for restricted gaming time using parental controls if you would like to. So there's that. Now some cons. It may be problematic for children whose executive functions haven't yet fully developed, and it can be associated with some difficulties in self-regulation. Where I think this becomes especially problematic with a game like this in particular is when it intrudes on daily activities, when it's all that the child is wanting to do. And so it's now interfering with sleep or with school or with social interaction or whatever. An interesting thing about Fortnite in particular that I think has made it continue to be so popular and addicting is that it includes daily challenges and intermittent rewarding, which can make it very habit forming and hard to step away from. And because it is a violent game, it does give exposure to weapons and murder, right, and violence. Okay? And a final thing is because of the audio and verbal interaction that can happen through Fortnite, if you so choose, there may be some grooming and other inappropriate behaviors via voice chat and private messages that happen that will require a lot more attentive parenting. So then how do we help parents? If parents are wanting to restrict their child's usage of these games or have more control over it, we can definitely help them by guiding them on things that they can do. One thing they can do is to activate parental controls in game systems. And I've provided instructions and or links that you can provide for your parents or for the parents that you work with, not for your parents, for the parents that you work with, or you can walk through with them for them to do this on Xbox One, Xbox Series X, PS5, PS4, and Nintendo Switch. So they're all of the main ones are there. Another strategy that you can use is to help parents to figure out how to change their Wi-Fi passwords to control the wireless internet a bit better. By doing this, the parent can set up a system where the child has to earn the password for the day or for the week or whatever by engaging in predefined pro-social behaviors or positive behaviors. Like once you do your chores, you get the password of the day or something like that, or once you do your homework or whatever. And so this is a skill that I think you would think that most people know how to do, but a lot of people don't. And so you might be able to help them with that. And then another thing is family gaming. Family gaming can be helpful. You'd be surprised, number one, how much more kids are willing to talk when they're playing a video game. I've done therapy before while playing a video game and find it really helpful. And then I think when you're involved in the game with the child, you're able to monitor it a bit better, right? So that can be helpful. All right, I'll end with saying that the picture is more complex than it would seem on the surface. Decisions about screen time in particular are made more complex when we consider child and parental characteristics. For example, we need to take the child's temperament into account as well as the parent's mental health. A parent who is struggling with their mental health may really need to lean on screen time to keep the child busy while they try to cope with their own stuff. Socioeconomic status also matters significantly. What a child has access to in terms of learning resources and things to engage their time, as well as what they have access to in terms of, video games and computers, for example. So I'd encourage you to consider each of the things that are listed here and how those might be associated with increased or decreased screen time, as well as how they might influence the impact of screen time on development. And then more generally, how these issues might affect development more broadly, cognitive and social development in middle childhood. Okay. All right. So that's it for this one. Definitely one that's interesting to discuss. So I'd look forward to talking about it with you in class, but let me know if you have any questions, and thank you for listening.